So if we go back to our notes and we open up to this page on the public reaction to these big businesses, that's where we're going to start today. So we learned that using the example of Andrew Carnegie in his steel industry and J.D. Rockefeller in his oil industry, the Standard Oil Trust, that these large, powerful, wealthy industrialists of the era were using all kinds of different strategies and methods to drive out their competition and take over their businesses and their industries. Of course, these were just two of the many, many examples of men who did this in their industries. The reason that this was able to exist this way was because of that social Darwinistic approach that we took at the time as a whole society to business and economics. It allowed this laissez-faire, hands-off kind of approach to competition. Well, today things don't work that exact same way. Of course, we still have a lot of those fundamental ideas about capitalism and about competition and about work and competing in the workforce as part of our system, the way our capitalist system works. But we've put things into place, and there are regulations and rules and laws that govern things so that we can't have men like Andrew Carnegie and J.D. Rockefeller rise to the power and wealth that they were able to do. Not only that, that's not it. Our system does allow people to rise to positions of power and great wealth, but not at the expense of their competition and other smaller businesses and entrepreneurs who are trying to make it. So it is a bit of a stretch to compare, as I've been saying throughout this chapter, to say that we live in a world today that was in many ways created by this era. That is true, but in many ways, the way our system works today is also very different. So, we can't talk about this era and what was going on and how our country was being affected by it without talking about this group of people. So we're going to spend time today not talking about the rich, powerful owners and leaders of these businesses, but the poor working class industrial workers who in many ways were the ones that were driving these businesses and these industries because of their labor. So a couple things. I found this image here. We're going to talk a little bit more about the man that took this photograph, but I just want to take a minute, and I'm going to try to move this a little closer for you. It's not that great. Let's see what I can do here. Let's move this a little bit closer for you. Sorry about that. Just give you an opportunity to take that image in there for a second. And there's a few things that you should be able to surmise about working class industrial workers of the time just from this one photograph. What are some things that you recognize right off the bat about this particular group of workers? You should recognize that they are what? They're all kids. In fact, if we were to investigate this further, we'd probably find out that I would say the majority of the kids that are in that photo are probably your age or younger, probably. The one in the very middle looks like he may be about your age, but then there's a few in there that look like they're even younger than you guys. So one of the things that sort of defined this era of industrial workers is child labor. We'll talk about that. What else can you say about these kids as they're posing for this photograph? What are some other things that you recognize? Just take a look at their faces and the facial expressions. Do they look like they're coming out of their mill or their factory or whatever with a big smile on their face? Their faces look hard. There's no smiles. They're sort of expressionless in many ways. You can see that they're very dirty. I don't know for sure without investigating a little further where I got this photo from, but just by looking at some of the headwear that these guys are wearing and even the lunch pails that they're using, that's not a dead giveaway, but they're probably working in some sort of mining operation, maybe coal mining or something like that. So their daily experience, these young kids that are about your age, certainly a lot different than the daily experiences that you have right now, okay? So we're gonna learn a little bit more about what those daily experiences were. But before we get into that, want to introduce you to this term right here, the Gilded Age. One of the probably several different names that is given to this era of American history is the Gilded Age. The term Gilded Age is based, it defines what some people's perspective of the time period, but also it's derived from what the term gilded actually means. Somebody know what that term means? Gilded, when something is gilded. Well, let me talk to you, the girls in particular, but maybe some of you guys too. I used to have my ears pierced. If you're wearing jewelry right now, not super expensive, like really good stuff, but the common day-to-day jewelry that probably is what we would more commonly wear on a daily basis, there's a good chance that the jewelry that you're wearing is gilded. So what do you think that means? When something is gilded, it essentially means that it is covered with an outer layer of gold. So in terms of the cheap everyday costume jewelry that you may wear, it's probably looks pretty and it's probably silver or gold or shiny, but there's a good chance that if you took something sharp and you scratched away at that surface, you'd probably be able to scratch the shiny gold or silver off and just reveal a dull gray metal underneath, because it's probably just a cheap metal covered with silver or gold paint or silver or gold plating to make it look pretty. Well, the idea of something being gilded is now applied to this time period, and we refer to it as the Gilded Age. So by definition, the way we're going to put it in our notes is this. The Gilded Age was a time in America when things looked great on the outside, but the reality was that underneath this great shiny exterior, there were a lot of problems kind of lurking in the background. And today we're going to get into some of the problems that lurked underneath that shiny exterior. Up to this point, we've really spent most of our time talking about the shiny golden cover of America at the time. We've talked about all of the new technologies and the new inventions. We've talked about the growth of these businesses and the expansion of products and the growth of cities and skyscrapers. Brooklyn bridges. I mean, people came into this country and they saw this Brooklyn Bridge, and that's a good example to help understand the Gilded Age, because people would look at something like the Brooklyn Bridge and just say, oh my goodness, who are these people? Where are we? How did they accomplish something like that? And then they turn around and look into the city behind the bridge and they'd see skyscrapers taller than anybody ever thought humans could build, and all of this money and wealth, and they'd say, holy cow, where are we? What is this place? And in many ways, that was all true. We had become the wealthiest country in the world. We had things that just didn't exist outside of our borders, and it looked pretty awesome. But if you started to scratch away a little bit at that Brooklyn Bridge, at those skyscrapers, and all that money and all that wealth, if you went down the street from the Brooklyn Bridge and around the corner away from that skyscraper, you'd go into parts of these cities that revealed that kind of underbelly part, that cheap underneath part that wasn't very shiny and it wasn't very glamorous. And unfortunately, that was the world that many of the industrial workers were living in. So let's talk about that workforce and who these people were. First of all, we talked about urbanization as one of the reasons that this even happened in this time period in America. And there was this massive migration, so I'm actually jumping down to the second bullet here, of people within the country moving into these cities, and cities just grew exponentially. 8 to 9 million people between 1860 and 1900 moved away from rural farm areas and migrated into these cities, and that's part of the reason they grew so rapidly. That's where the work was, that's where these new jobs were, these new industries, and that's where money could be made. But it wasn't just those 8 to 9 million Americans moving into cities. We have this massive influx of immigration after the Civil War between 1860 and 1900. Over 14 million immigrants came into our borders in this time period. And where did most of them end up when they got off of these boats in these cities? In these cities, right? And so with all of this massive urbanization, we see this massive growth of cities, but we also see the development of the workforce that was necessary for this to happen, right? And it was these millions of immigrants and people that moved into cities that made up the workforce that would drive this industrial era. The workforce that lived in these cities and worked in these industries and these businesses, they lived hard lives. We're going to talk a little bit about their home lives and their work lives. A couple general things here. In most cases, in most families in these situations, the entire family had to go to work. It wasn't adults go to work and kids go to school. It certainly wasn't dad or the man of the house or one of the parents goes to work and the other stays home and takes care of the house. No, entire families had to go and work in these factories and these mills to support the family. And that would be just enough so that they could get by and survive. So children had to quit school at very young ages. We know at this time period we now have public education, not just in the North either. After the war, public education systems developed in the South, but a lot of kids go to school for kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and then at that point, they got to quit because the family needs them to be bringing in income. So unfortunately, a lot of kids never get to enjoy the wonderful thing that you get to enjoy every day as you're sitting here listening to this, school, all the way up through what you're going to go through grade 12 and maybe even beyond that, right? Oh, isn't it terrible that you have to sit here and listen to this? Well, when you learn about the lives that they had to endure once they quit school, you're going to see that, boy, do we have it lucky here, right? The reality for most of these families in the situation was that they were poor. They were at the bottom of the barrel. They were, in many cases, because entire families had to work to survive, if you didn't have enough income coming in, you would barely scrape by. There was no real government aid like we have today. We have welfare systems, we have social security systems, we have all kinds of agencies put in place to look out for and help those people in our society that are struggling from poverty. That didn't exist. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't agencies out there and there weren't individuals that realized, hey, we have to help some of these people. But those charitable private organizations were limited. They couldn't handle the amount of poverty in these big cities. Now, that is not to say that there weren't enough charity organizations. The reality is there were too many people that needed help. All right, so that's just some kind of big picture things. Let's take a look at some more specifics. Whoa, look at that. Don't worry, you can pause it and write all this down, but I'm just going to keep going and we'll go through some bullet points here that explain essentially the daily life of an industrial worker in the workplace. Then we'll talk a little bit more and we'll do some activities to learn a little bit more about their living conditions. So let's talk about work. The reality was that most industrial workers worked 6 to 7 days a week. We learned when we learned a little bit about Andrew Carnegie and what he did in his factories. I think we watched a little bio of him. In many cases, his workers worked 7 days a week, 364 days out of the year. They said that he gave his workers 1 day off a year. So do we work 6 to 7 days a week now? No, the typical work week is a 5-day work week in the world that we live in. They would work 12, 13, 14, sometimes 15, 16 hours a day. Do we do that today? Do you know what the typical workday is today? In most cases, it's an 8-hour workday. Now, it doesn't mean that doesn't vary for some people, but they oftentimes worked in situations where they worked with piecework. Piecework was a system, and it's not used very much today. There are still some scenarios in factory work where it's prevalent, but there are rules and regulations against it. So even when we use piecework today, it's different. Piecework worked this way. You would get paid a fixed amount for every piece that you completed. So whatever your job was, let's just say your job was to pick up this nut and this bolt off the conveyor belt and put them together and then put them on this conveyor belt. Every one of those you did, you'd get paid a certain amount, which meant the more nuts and bolts you put together, the more money you could make. This system certainly favored some workers and put other workers at a disadvantage. If you were faster, if you were stronger, if you were younger, if you were healthy versus being sick at the time, the piecework system was designed to create competition. And the faster you can work, the more money you can make. The faster you're working, it's worth it for me to pay you a little bit more because I'm getting more out of what you're working for. So that was one of the ways that they tried to be as efficient and get as much work done as possible. Efficiency really is what these factory owners were looking for. Whenever we talked about the way that they would compete with one another, efficiency was the key. In fact, there were people that studied this at this time period and tried to understand and figure out ways to make the workplace more efficient. Frederick Winslow Taylor was a very famous efficiency expert at the time who studied the workplace and factories and workers and bosses and relationships and all this kind of stuff, and he figured out ways and he would, people like Frederick Winslow Taylor could be brought into a factory and they would be paid to study it, investigate it, and then find ways to make the factory more efficient. Ultimately, what these owners of these factories were looking for were ways to increase their profits. So if it simply means, hey, one way to get more work done is to just speed up the machines, speed up the conveyor belts, well, then that's what we'll do. If we speed up the conveyor belts, more nuts and bolts will come down those conveyor bolts every day. But do you think that in a piecework system where every nut and every bolt that you put together, you got paid a certain amount, if we sped up the conveyor belts, and now you could work faster on your own, but the conveyor belts are now working faster with you, do you think that increased the pay that the workers would get? No, because what these owners would do is simply speed up the machines, but then just lower the amount per piece that they would pay their workers. So the workers, their pay might end up staying the same, but they'd be making more pieces than they were before. So who would be getting more money in that scenario? If the factory's pumping out more pieces, but paying the worker the same that they were paying before, the worker doesn't gain, but the owner of the factory does, because now he's getting more things made and he's selling more pieces. So it was all about improving efficiency, but it was really all about increasing profits that would go into the pockets of the owners. So just general hardships that went along with this type of work in a factory or in a mill. The relationship that existed between bosses, the owners, the managers, and the workers really was non-existent. There was no relationship. Bosses knew very little about their workers. They didn't know their names, they didn't know where they lived, they didn't know if they had families, because they didn't care. All they really cared about was that they did their work for them. The bosses that were on the floors, the managers that were actually working in these workplaces were very strict. There is a lot of evidence that they would even use physical violence as a way to coerce workers into obedience and to work fast. That was part of the reason that many employers like to hire women and children, because they were easier to handle, so to speak, in terms of the strict regulations that were put on the workers. With that, there's no job protection. If you got hurt, what did they do? You're gone. You're fired. Because we have immigrants, 14 million immigrants coming off of boats that are looking for jobs. We'll just hire one of them to take your place. There's no workman's compensation. There's no paid time off. If you can't work, you're gone. The thing that makes that so outrageous and so devastating for many of these workers is that the work itself was extremely dangerous. So the idea of getting hurt was very common. And when you did get hurt, you were out, didn't get a paycheck. Because these businesses, these factories, these industries were extremely loud. People would lose their hearing. They were poorly ventilated. People would get all kinds of illnesses and sicknesses from breathing in the dust and the lint and the soot and the smoke. These places were fire traps. There were accidents all the time. Things would explode. Places would catch on fire. There was no ideas about or really any cares about safety measures or safety equipment. So the machines were very dangerous. As I said up here, there was no injury compensation. There's no workman's compensation. If you get injured, sorry. And the unfortunate reality was that many people suffered injuries. Many people were killed in these scenarios, working in these conditions. Sounds crazy, right? Who would want to do that? But the reality was, these factories had no shortage of people lining up to endure these conditions, because these were the best opportunities that immigrants, people with low education, people that didn't have any money and any training, people that lived in these cities, these were their best options. And the reality also was that they did make money. They may not, they may be poor and be struggling to get by, but in many cases, people had more money in their pockets than we had in eras previously. So even if you were poor, and you were just barely scraping by to be able to feed your family and pay your rent and everything like that, there was always, just because of the nature of this economic system, there was always a few cents left or a nickel for you to go and buy a book that you could read for entertainment. Or there was always a few cents left to buy some luxury item at the grocery store, some treat that you could have after dinner with your family. With all the new technologies and inventions, new forms of entertainment were developing, like eventually, not movies like we go to now, but there's going to be opportunities to go and see these new motion pictures. There's going to be opportunities to listen to music in ways that we couldn't listen to before, and so on and so forth. So people were willing to line up for these jobs, even though they were difficult, to get those paychecks. And unfortunately, these were the only jobs that were available, these types of jobs for many of these people. So there's a little bit about what it was like to live in this situation, right? Actually, to work in this situation. We're going to get to the living arrangements separately. All right, so just two groups in particular. We talked on that last slide about just some generic things. Women and children were impacted differently, not necessarily more significantly than men, but it was just different. Women had it worse than the men. Women, as you can imagine, we've talked about this earlier in this semester with the women's rights movement in Seneca Falls and things like that. Women did not get the higher paying jobs, they got the lower paying jobs. Women did not have access to get education, to get training, to move up. They did not get opportunities to work the more complex machines that might come with a higher paycheck. That was reserved for men. Children. In many cases, employers were looking for children, depending on the work especially. I know it doesn't sound like a big number, but children made up about 5% of the workforce in the 1880s. Doesn't sound like a big percentage, but that 5% was of millions and millions of working class people. So we're talking tons and tons of children, ages 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, working in these conditions. And there were no laws to stop anything like this. Today, you can't even go get any kind of job, let alone a job in a factory, because you're not 15 or 16. We have regulations and rules. That didn't exist at this time period. Speaking of that particular picture, we're going to get you a little bit closer to this guy too. Take a look at these little guys working in what's probably that's thread there on spools. It's some sort of textile industry. I'm not sure what they're making. But just take a look at some things here, some interesting things. Number one, these kids are pretty young. You should be able to see that. How about that kid in the foreground closest to you? See anything peculiar about him? Yeah, you should see, holy cow. Yeah, that kid's barefoot. Now, he's working barefoot for a number of different reasons, I suppose, and we don't know for sure. What do you think one reason that kid's going to work barefooted might be, based on what I just went over? Yeah, he might not be able to afford a pair of shoes because his family's so impoverished. I don't know. This kid's got shoes on. Could be it. Another reason? Look at the work that they're doing. This is part of the reason they would like to hire small children for this. He has to crawl on top of these machines. He's got to get down in there. He's got to change spools of threads out. They liked having small kids that could get into these machines and do this very meticulous work sometimes. And I wouldn't be surprised if this kid said, you know what? Forget the shoes. If I have my bare feet and I got my little gripper toes, I can crawl around this thing on this thing way easier and way faster. Yeah, it's way easier and way faster to lose a few toes that way as well, though, right? But this was the world of work at the time. So a little bit about women and children. Okay, so that's just sort of me scratching the surface. That's the tip of the iceberg, just some general basic information. The reality is this. What I just described to you isn't something that throughout the era improves and gets better. It's actually the opposite. As this era progresses into the 1880s and then into the 1890s and into 1900, these working and living conditions, we'll get to in a second, they get worse and worse. Things don't get better, they actually get worse. As the businesses grow and get bigger, the work gets harder, more dangerous, the pay gets lower, the ability to survive gets more difficult. It's not something that gets better, it gets worse. And eventually, you're going to be diving a little deeper into these living arrangements, because I didn't even get into what it was like to live in these cities. Eventually, a guy by the name of Jacob Rees starts to investigate this whole situation for working class people in the time period. He ends up writing a book in 1890 called How the Other Half Lives. And we're not going to read that book, but when you're done with this, you are going to read one excerpt from the book. Actually, you're going to read a couple snippets from the book. We're just going to read about the book and about the man. So I'm going to allow that, plus a little video that you're going to be watching, teach you a little bit more about the living conditions. I spent some time on the working conditions. You're going to do a little on your own to learn more about the living conditions. But what I'm going to start you off with is just one more picture. By the way, all of the pictures that I've showed you on this slideshow were pictures that were taken by Jacob Rees, and you're going to learn a little bit more about that. So if I get a little closer to this guy, one of the things you're going to be learning about were these living arrangements for these working class people living in what were called tenement houses. They became sort of the common sort of group living apparatus of the time period. And as you watch the video and read the next assignment, you're going to learn a little bit more about that. But here's an image that Jacob Rees took of one of the rooms inside a tenement house. And I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but I just want you to look around on this image and see what you see. First of all, this is one room that would be rented to an entire family, and it looks to me like there's more than a family here. Just a quick glance, how many faces do you see in there? I see 1, 2, 3. Let's see, let's get a little closer. I see a face laying back here. Obviously you can see this guy up here. There's a face right there. There's one right there. I think there might be one back here. There are 1, 2 over here. And then in the foreground here, you can see some feet sticking out here. I have a feeling there's another body over here that didn't get into the picture. So there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 people in that one picture, in that one room, all living together. Guess what? There's a good chance that when those 8 guys there get up from their sleep and go off to work their shift, 6, 7, or 8 more people come back to this tenement house and they take shifts sleeping and living in there when these guys are at work. That way it would save on a lot of the costs of living in a place like this. Now you're going to learn a little bit more about these conditions and how bad it was, and I'm going to leave you to it as you get into How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Rees. All right?